My name is Paul Douglas, and I'm your host for Critical Thinking for Mormons. I'd like to welcome you to episode number 2.
So introspective and reflective. Introspection is the art of being aware of your thinking. The quality of our thoughts reflects the quality of our actions. Thinking about our ideas not only affects our behavior, it also predicts our success. It's the ability to examine our innermost thoughts and feelings, providing insight into our emotional and mental state. The first dimension of emotional intelligence is self-awareness. Abraham Lincoln was once asked how long it took him to write the Gettysburg Address. He replied, "All my life." Lincoln was an introspective man. I don't doubt he could have been able to write the Gettysburg Address without looking inside himself first. Introspection is an essential feature of critical thinking. But as I've already indicated, it's a luxury that many Mormons simply don't have time for. We're all familiar with Socrates' famous statement, "The unexamined life is not worth living."
Yep. I said it before and I'll say it again. Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Capable critical thinkers are also commonly creative thinkers. They reject standardized formats for problem solving, choosing instead to think outside the box. Furthermore, they often demonstrate a wide range of interests. They're polymaths, like a radiologist who's also a broadcaster, writer, comic puppeteer, and philosopher. I think Joseph Smith was a creative thinker as well as a critical thinker, but the former more than the latter. There's ample evidence of his creativity. His mother raved about how he could keep the family spellbound as a boy, telling delicious stories of the history of the Indians, as he referred to them at that time. There was never a skeleton or an artifact that he came across that he failed to weave some tale around. The Book of Abraham papyrus, Zelph, the Kinderhook plates. But I think he was also a critical thinker. That's why he made so many revisions and rewrites to his writings and revelations. He never stopped thinking about or reconstructing his gospel. The difference between critical thinking and creative thinking is that creative thinking is related to the generation of ideas, whereas critical thinking is associated with the analysis and evaluation of those ideas. Creative thinking is generative, while critical thinking is analytical. Creative thinking is focused on possibilities, whereas critical thinking is focused on probabilities.
But thinking outside the box can take courage. Challenging the status quo takes guts. I got a great deal of flack when I suggested in my letter to an apostle that Mormons are not altogether virtuous people. Don't get me wrong, I believe that rank-and-file Mormons are good people. The average Latter-day Saint is an honest, kind, decent individual, trying his or her best to raise a family with strong moral values. They're good neighbors and they're good citizens. Some of the finest people I've ever met were Latter-day Saints, Eldon Tanner and Hugh B. Brown, who I knew when they served in our small Canadian branch back in the 1950s, were good men.
But in the Greek, virtuous, anathema, means more than good. It means courageous. It connotes someone who has the audacity to stand up to authority, who demands truth and personal freedom, someone willing to question the status quo. And if you'll forgive me, few Mormons are that. Latter-day Saints are largely a tractable lot. Too often obedience has replaced critical thinking, and conformity has replaced courage.
Perhaps this is why during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, when men and women of goodwill in this country were marching with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., seeking equal rights for all of God's children, when we saw Catholics, Protestants, Jews, even human secularists display the courage to speak up, we didn't hear from Mormons. Rather, they bowed to their leaders, who continued to preach discriminatory, racist Mormon doctrines and hateful policies harming persons of color.
As late as the 1970s, the Mormon Church was banning black boys from becoming Boy Scout troop leaders. These leadership positions were reserved exclusively for white priesthood-holding Mormon boys. In fact, it took the NAACP to file a federal lawsuit against the church in 1974 to force the church to reverse this hurtful and discriminatory policy. Indeed, in 1966, the NAACP issued a statement criticizing the LDS Church, saying that the church maintained a rigid and continuous segregation stand, and I'm quoting here, that the church had made no effort to counteract its widespread discriminatory practices in education, in housing and employment, or in other areas of life. Is it not deeply troubling that Ezra Taft Benson, later to become the president of the Mormon Church, was one of the country's most strident voices opposing the national crusade for African American civil rights? In 1965 and in 1967, Benson stated in televised sermons from Temple Square that the so-called civil rights movement, as he referred to it, was a communist program for revolution in America. Benson's rhetoric intensified after, despite his best efforts, the Federal Civil Rights Act was ratified. Benson wrote the foreword for a race-hate book entitled The Black Hammer, a study of black power, red influence, and white alternatives. The cover of this vile little book shows a thick-lipped, low-browed, decapitated, bleeding head of an African-American man superimposed upon the symbol of communism, the hammer and sickle. Yes, the church's apologists will excuse Benson's racist sentiments, as well as those of Brigham Young, as just a product of their time. But I find it hard to accept that a character like Ezra Taft Benson was supposedly God's spokesman on earth. Certainly not all Mormons in the 1960s shared the church's racist mindset. In a piece entitled George Romney and the Delbert Stapley Letter, my friend Jonathan Streeter well encapsulates and illustrates the gulf that existed between the thinking of the Mormon leadership and the hearts and minds of American people, including many progressive Mormons. Perhaps not all of my listeners or viewers know that Mitt Romney was not the first Romney to carve out a notable place in American politics. In 1964, George Romney, Mitt's father, was the governor of Michigan, and like his son, a respected voice on the right. Although George Romney's upbringing in the church certainly inculcated the Mormon teachings of the inferior status in life of blacks as a result of their lack of valor in the pre-mortality stage, Romney had come to realize the humanity and potential of African Americans. Theodore H. White, in his book The Making of the President, quotes George Romney as saying, "It was only after I got to Detroit and got to know Negroes and began to be able to evaluate them that I began to recognize that some Negroes are better and more capable than lots of whites." Despite the teachings of the Mormon Church, as governor, Romney made racial equality a top priority, not only campaigning on a civil rights platform, but upon his election, working to fulfill his campaign promises. In his first State of the State address, he declared that Michigan's most urgent human rights problem is racial discrimination in housing, in public accommodations, education, administration of justice, and in employment. George Romney also helped create Michigan's first Civil Rights Commission and appointed a black man as a special advisor on minority relations. Romney also appointed an African American as the vice chairman of the state's Republican Party. In short, George Romney not only talked the talk, he also walked the walk when it came to overcoming systemic racism. It was after hearing Romney speak in support of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 that church leaders finally attempted to rein in George, who was unquestionably the most powerful Mormon in U.S. politics. On the 23rd of January 1964, Mormon apostle Delbert Stapley, in a letter to Romney, reminded him of several aspects of LDS theology and doctrine regarding the Negro. I won't bore you with Stapley's entire condescending letter, which not only lectures Romney, but also gives him a number of reading assignments. But in his letter, Stapley justifies the church's racism, quoting Joseph Smith and other past Mormon leaders, and issues Romney with a stern warning that if he continues down the path that he's entered on, his future may be just as unhappy as Lincoln, McKinley, and Kennedy. When I reflect upon the prophet's statements and remember what happened to three of our nation's presidents, who were very active in the Negro cause, I'm sobered by their demise. They went contrary to the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, unwittingly, no doubt, but nevertheless the prophecy of Joseph Smith. Those who are determined to pursue a course which shows an opposition and a feverish relentlessness against the decrees of the Lord will learn, when perhaps it's too late for their own good, that God can do his own work without the aid of those who are not dictated by his counsel. He concludes his cheery letter with Joseph Smith's suggestion that we should buy up all the Negro slaves and transport them back to Africa from whence they came, send them back to where they came from. In 1978, as we all are aware, President Spencer W. Kimball, shortly after meeting with U.S. President Jimmy Carter, announced that he had received a revelation reversing the priesthood ban on African Americans. On the question of blacks in the priesthood, most of the church's apologists deny that the visit with President Carter had anything to do with his timely revelation. Some even claim that President Carter never even broached the subject. This is simply not true. I asked President Carter directly that question. His reply to me was, "Paul, we never threatened them, but I expressed my opinion to the LDS leaders." I think this Mormon mindset, obedience over independent thought, is also why during the Second World War, not only did German Mormons go along to get along with the Nazis, But as David C. Nelson commented in his book Moroni and the Swastika, Mormons were not just tolerant of Hitler, they were downright enthusiastic. The best critical thinkers are also analytical thinkers, and vice versa. The ability to analyze data is essential. Analyzing information means to deconstruct that information to its parts and evaluate how well those parts function both separately as well as together. The fifth feature of the critical thinker is humility. While on the surface having humility and empathy and compassion may seem almost deleterious to critical thinking, after all, emotion and sentimentality can skew our perception of a given situation. Without humility, however, and our ability to put ourselves in the shoes of others, we might view all information and situations from the viewpoint of cold, heartless scientific fact and data. Good critical thinkers take into account the human element. Not everything is about data, information, and outcomes. It's also about people. Critical thinkers are humble while searching for truth, enabling them to learn new things without their ego fighting against them. Those with humility are aware of their flaws as well as their strengths, an important element in critical thinking as it demonstrates a willingness to stretch and open one's mind. One of the greatest constructs to impact American industry that came along during my career as a management consultant is emotional intelligence. One of the essential building blocks of EQ is self-awareness. For decades, I used Joe Harry's window at leadership development seminars as a tool for illustrating the importance of self-awareness and to improve communication and team building. Joe Harry's window was devised by two American psychologists, Joseph Luft and Harry Ingham, both at the University of California, Los Angeles. The name Joe Harry's window comes, of course, from a combination of their first two names, Joe and Harry. In a nutshell, the four Joe Harry's windows are called regions or quadrants. Each one of these quadrants represents information, feelings, motivations, etc., that are either known or unknown to the individual, and whether the same information is known or unknown to other people. The four quadrants in this model are illustrated on this chart. Quadrant 1 is the public you. It's the you that everybody knows and loves. It's the behavior and skills that are, of course, reflective of your attitude, feelings, and motivations. But it's not the only you. We all wear masks for various reasons, Mormons more than many. As Mormons, we're under the obligation to be a good example, so others will join the church. Our authenticity is to some degree sacrificed on the altar of being a good example. This results in us making the church look good through faking happiness, faking righteousness, faking competency, faking joy, and faking a happy marriage. Is it any wonder that antidepressant use is so high in Utah? Joseph Smith preached that happiness is the object and design of our existence, and will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it. And this path is virtue, uprightness, faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all the commandments of God. So if I'm not happy, then I'm not living all the commandments, or I'm not virtuous or faithful, let alone holy. Authenticity is not valued in Mormonism. I can think of numerous examples of inauthenticity practiced by Gordon B. Hinckley, or Jeffrey Holland, or John Taylor, or many, many others. Quadrant 2 is made up of those things that are known to us but not known to other people. And I'm not just thinking about the skeletons in our closets, and there may be some of those, but the things that we never share with other people, and I don't care how intimate the relationship is that you're in with another person. They'll never know you as well as you know you. Quadrant 3 is made up of those things that are known to other people but not known to us. Again, none of us see ourselves exactly as others see us. Robbie Burns, the great bard, used to say, the gift of Gia is to see ourselves as others see us. None of us do. Some of us are closer to reality than others. Some of us are right out there in left field. The higher up the hierarchy one rises in the Mormon Church, the less likely it is that one will be given feedback, constructive or otherwise, by those below. Elder Oaks even codified it. It's wrong to criticize leaders of the church, even when the criticism is true. Alfred Lord Tennyson expressed greater wisdom when he said, "He is all fault who has no fault at all." Quadrant 4 is made up of those things that are neither known to us nor are they known to other people, yet they exist, and they influence our behavior in profound ways. This is the subconscious and certainly beyond the scope of this discussion, as well as my training and capabilities. When we think propaganda, most of us think of Paul Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda in Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1945. But the real father of this dubious art was Edward Louis Bernays, an American pioneer in the field of public relations, and the nephew of Sigmund Freud. In fact, Goebbels relied on Bernays' book, Crystallizing Public Opinion, to formulate his vile campaign against the Jews. Bernays was the first to focus on manipulating public opinion through the use of the subconscious. He called this technique of opinion molding the engineering of consent, and it was employed in 1917 by President Woodrow Wilson in the Committee on Public Information to drum up support for the First World War. Indeed, in one form or another, it's been utilized to promote every foreign war the United States has engaged in since that time. Not only did Bernays help convince Americans to support World War I, but he also convinced women to smoke cigarettes, Americans to use disposable Dixie cups, and to drink fluoridated water. His philosophy is reflected in the following Orwellian statement. If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing about it? The recent practices in propaganda have proved that it is possible, at least to a certain degree and within certain limits. I've got a feeling that Bernays didn't truly believe that there were any limits. Bernays liked to think of himself as a kind of psychoanalyst to troubled corporations. Are there examples of Bernays' techniques being employed today by the brethren? In the words of the darling Elizabeth Barrett Browning, let me count the ways. When we self-disclose to others, the public self becomes larger and the private self becomes smaller. When we receive honest feedback from other people, it also enlarges the public self and reduces the size of our blind zone. There's a tendency, however, for underlings to be very reluctant to provide honest feedback to individuals in power. It's the shoot the messenger problem. Enlightened leaders encourage it, but sadly not all who hold the reins of power are enlightened. Who in the 12 has the courage to tell President Nelson to stop with the bogus miracle stories? Why is critical thinking important? Well, for one thing, self-defense. You come home late one night. It's dark. You're alone. And as you use your key to open the door, you find it's open. In fact, it's ajar. You think to yourself, that's strange. I'm sure I locked my door. But as you step into the foyer and notice that many things are askew, items are on the floor, pictures are down from the wall, it suddenly strikes you that you may have been burglarized. Just at that moment, however, you suddenly are grabbed from behind by a hulk of a man. If you're trained in self-defense techniques, would it increase or improve your chances of survival? Of course it would. Self-defense opens up a source of freedom for women and men in a world where not everyone is kind and honest and has your best interests at heart. The same is true when it comes to critical thinking. And while the antagonists in this arena may not want to physically harm you, they want you to believe what they believe, value what they value, and do what they want you to do. Well, who are these people? Pretty much everybody that you'll come in contact with. Parents have an interest in exerting influence over their children, even their grown children. Friends seek to influence you, as does your boss. Co-workers and subordinates. But where I think the self-defense analogy fits best is in our interactions with large and powerful social institutions, such as political parties, the media, advertisers, and most importantly, large and powerful organized religious bodies, whose job it is to get you to think as they think and do as they do, who have an enormous amount of resources and expertise at their disposal to accomplish their task. The goal in politics is to acquire support, to gain and maintain power. In the field of advertising, the goal is to sell products and services. And while in the case of high-demand religious organizations of the corporate ilk, Mormonism and Scientology perhaps being the best two examples, the stated goal may be to save souls or change hearts and minds and encourage good works, but the real purpose, in the organizational bureaucratic sense, is to recruit and maintain membership, followers, so they can acquire their time, their talents, and their fortunes. I'm not suggesting that there aren't good people in politics or business or advertising or religion who sincerely want to serve the needs of other people. The point is, however, that these institutions themselves often care little about what matters to their constituencies. What they value, what's meaningful to them, is anything that maintains their viability. These powerful organizations have a logic and a dynamic all their own. But here's the rub. By knowing which buttons to push, these manipulative gods of influence can effectively get us to believe something or do something that is altogether irrational and illogical. This is the primary reason why we need to enhance our critical thinking skills, self-preservation. The primary tool manipulators use is emotion. Human beings are emotional creatures as well as thinking ones. The Greek philosophers realized that people can sometimes be persuaded by the force of feelings and emotions alone. This approach is called Pathos. We're guided and controlled by our emotions, as exemplified by the fight-or-flight response. Our everyday habits, our routines, rituals, attitudes, and perceptions are all influenced by our emotions, so much so that we don't even realize sometimes when we're being programmed by them. When we become overwhelmed by an emotion, it seems to take over our perception and awareness of life at that moment. The present moment experience is seen through the lens of emotion. If we're overwhelmed by joy or happiness or sadness or fear or love or lust or any other emotion, we're hard-pressed to think or feel anything else. We're feeling and sensing organisms. Our mind is rationalizing what our brain has already sensed.
Well, this concludes today's broadcast. This is Paul Douglas inviting you to tune in next week for another edition of Critical Thinking for Mormons.